The funny thing about history is that we tend to forget about as much as we remember. The written records can serve us to a point, but any coherent picture of a historical event or a historical individual can be manipulated if the person writing the record has another agenda. This obviously isn't going to make every record unreliable, or we wouldn't know anything about history. The key is to get as close to the event itself and examine what else we know about what led up to the event. We will use this criteria to examine two events, or rather, to a series of events that took place in the history of medieval Europe: the Viking Raids in Northern Europe and the Crusades in Southern Europe. We will examine the records that we've recovered after these events took place and compare them to the religious and historical texts that led up to and perhaps motivated these events. From these, we can examine and test whether or not these atrocities that were indeed committed on both sides were justified either from their religion, from their culture, or out of a need for self-preservation. So, starting with the Crusades, we're going to examine both the Crusades and the Viking Raids from this criteria, in noting first, what do the records say? Second, of course, the atrocities that were committed during those times, but also noting what led up to the events and what motivated these events. The motivation will be examined as to whether their sacred text, their culture, or self-preservation was indeed the motivating factor, and we will apply the same standard consistently for the Viking raids as well. So starting with the Crusades, we need to ask the question, what do the records say? Well, the first four Crusades in particular, there were others, but in the 8th century, early 7th century if you note that he came into the world at this time, but a man who is referred to as Muhammad established a religion that unified the Arabian Peninsula based on, at least relevant to the topic, two key principles. Fight the Christians and Jews until they convert or pay the living tax, what's referred to as the jizya, for living in Muslim lands as a subjugated people. This is according to Surah chapter 9, or Surah means chapter, but Surah 9:29 of the Quran. Now, as this example was set forward for the Muslims, by the time we reach the era and time period that the Crusades and the Viking raids in medieval Europe were both taking place, constant infighting had been taking place between Sunni and Shia sects of Islam. Now, the Islamic Empire that had been established for the past 2 centuries was following an interesting policy. When the Seljuk Turks took over Jerusalem and sacked the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, this was in contradiction to the policy of the previous occupiers, who, since the time of Umar, one of Muhammad's companions and the rightly guided caliph that was third in line, second in line, allowed the Christians to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem where this shrine was located. The tax, the jizya, was the sole condition that kept them from being persecuted and outed from the city and formed the foundation of their primary income while occupying these Christian lands. Meanwhile, the Muslim expansion into Europe from Africa and Spain as well resulted and was taking place alongside several failed attempts to take Constantinople that continued for 2 full centuries, ironically enough, during the same time that the Vikings were invading from the north. When the Byzantine emperor of the Christians from the east asked for help from the Pope in the west, the sacking of the shrine that they both considered the sacred site of Jesus' burial and resurrection made up Pope Urban II's mind to send military aid to the east. The problem is that the Roman Catholic Church wasn't a government, thus didn't have a military, but they did have followers, so they converted into one. Recruitment began with the statement that anyone who dies with the cross upon his person, and this is a quote, would be given a preliminary indulgence. That is, according to the dogma and tradition of the Roman Catholic Church, not of the Bible, any indulgence of sin in either the past or the future would be written off their record according to Roman Catholic tradition. This developed over time into a regular call for penance through these crusades, and this gathered a large number of peasants as well as nobles to participate in these gatherings. Now, the First Crusade was actually a military escorted pilgrimage, not necessarily an invasion, but a opportunity to travel to Jerusalem where they could repair these holy sites as well as visit them without worrying about the harassment of the Muslims they would experience when traveling through Asia Minor. The Byzantines would also be allowed to travel with them. This military escort for this pilgrimage ensured their safe travel and would ensure the restoration of these sacred sites. But note that the individuals escorting them weren't exactly the most savory of individuals. Very interesting events took place along the way, which we will clarify when we get to the atrocities committed. The Second Crusade never went to Jerusalem, but ultimately lost ground when they made to reestablish safe travel again through Asia Minor as a militarily escorted pilgrimage in response to Muslim aggression along the way. Lesbos was retaken, but Syria and southern Turkey were lost. Now, the Third Crusade was a more organized military expedition where Europe was called to reopen the now cut off route to these sacred sites in order to make sure they could travel safely to their religiously significant locations. Suffering heavy losses along the way, a superior general in the Muslim world named Saladin routed the Crusader forces and prevented them from establishing a foothold in Egypt and Antioch. These were strategically significant because they were the major port cities in that area of the world. The Fourth Crusade was difficult given that the road by land was cut off from their prior losses and decided to make the journey by sea with a fleet they couldn't pay for and with not enough soldiers to accomplish the task. Instead, the Byzantine and Catholic political rivalries reignited when this crusade force meant to help them turned on and attacked them instead. They failed and were called out for going against the Pope's orders, resulting in their excommunication from the church. Now a rogue military force, they attacked the capital of the Byzantine Empire and disbanded with the wealth they took from the encounter. It was a total failure and is remembered as such by the Christians and Muslims in the Christian and Muslim worlds to this day. Now, what were the atrocities committed? There are many. I will cite 4 for the sake of time. During the First Crusade, the military forces escorting the pilgrimage robbed, butchered, and looted Jewish communities they encountered along the way. It's also worth noting that the Bible was not accessible to most of these people, and mercenaries were recruited to bolster their numbers. So you can say this was not only a non-Christian action, but a doubly uninformed anti-Christian action. During a famine that spread between southern Turkey and Syria while the Crusader force happened to be there, the pilgrims were forced to eat the bodies of the dead to survive the winter. When Jerusalem was first taken, civilians were not spared. Jews and Muslims were both treated as combatants and thus murdered, a war crime, by the military forces in order to clear the way for the pilgrims to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And finally, the Fourth Crusade in its entirety was a complete betrayal of the Byzantine forces who were calling for aid from Muslim aggression. Now, what led up to these events? First, the fall of the Roman Empire. A full century before the events that caused the First Crusade, Rome had fallen to the Visigoth and Hunnic raids from the east. Europe had no military, government, or state enforcement of their borders apart from an individual's right to self-preservation. This is what led to feudalism, the second event that led up to the Crusades. After centuries of the Viking raids from the north, which by the way were before the Crusades, Asian raids from the east, and Muslim expansion and aggression from the south, the only people with the ability to defend themselves effectively were, first of all, nobles with fortified estates known as castles, and armed bodyguards who were trained as knights. The citizens of the now non-existent Roman Empire sold themselves to these nobles in exchange for several months of free labor. They would be provided access to these fortifications and protection from these bodyguards during a time of crisis, which was frequent. This established the makeup of life in medieval Europe. The only common factor throughout Europe wasn't their citizenship, but their religion. When it came time for any cohesive attempt to protect the European nations, well, they used this as the sole uniting factor to make the church the state. The only unifying factor. It was not their nationality, it was their religion. Christianity was united by this. So when the church became the state, it was to fill a vacuum, not to fulfill an intended purpose or necessarily even the goal or intention of the church itself. Now, also note that when this unideal situation had made it so that the Catholic Church had to fill in a void and united these people without really knowing how to organize a military, because the Bible doesn't say that's what you're supposed to do, this was most especially made manifest, not just because the infighting in the Islamic Empire made them vulnerable to a largely victimized European culture, but also noting that we see Europe's state when Peter the Hermit gathered the People's Crusade and, in their righteous zealotry, decided not to walk along with their military escort and ended up butchered by the militarized culture of Islam. So, with all of this said, what motivated these events? Was it their sacred text? Did the Bible motivate, justify, and command the Crusades to be performed? The answer is definitively no. Every mention of warfare in the Old Testament was not only unknown, if not unavailable to the Crusaders, but against specific people at specific times in history. It was always descriptive, but never prescriptive for Christians to fight on the basis of what they believed. The example and commands of Jesus, as well as the historical examples of his followers, have one recorded mention of them taking up the sword to defend Jesus in any sort of religious sense. When they were going to arrest and ultimately execute him, that was the time to draw your sword. And according to the biographical accounts known as the Gospels, Jesus condemned the individual and told him to put the sword away. It took a full 1,000 years removed from the life of Jesus for Christians to gather together for a war in any sense. Between now and then, the Saint Augustine, who is a philosopher and a great thinker in early church history, established the just war theory as a necessary evil, according to his writings, that required penance. And also note that it was justified to defend the oppressed, but no farther. If any example was taken from Jesus as inspiration for the Crusades, it apparently was a different Jesus than the one established in history, let alone in their religious text. So if you believe the Bible or you don't, you'd have to acknowledge that the Crusaders did this in spite of, not in light of, their religious text. Was it their culture? Perhaps. And here's why. While the majority of the people in Europe at this time called themselves Christians, they were merely one generation removed from the fall of the Roman Empire. While Christianity doesn't have a prescribed form of government, Europe had once dominated the world on the basis of Roman tradition and culture. And while Christians can't justify from their culture or government any form of kinetic warfare, referring to physical war, the Romans certainly had an established policy on how to deal with invaders. This could have been a motivating factor, but again, we can't say for certain. Was it self-preservation? Absolutely. The Vikings from the north, the Vandals from the east, and the Muslims from the south had put Europe in a constant state of threat that literally redefined their society from the ground up. When the one unifying factor of religion established a new form of government in response to an atrocity committed overseas, all factors would lead us to conclude that the concept of fighting back after 400 years of taking it on the chin with no recourse is justified. Not the atrocities committed, note, but the concept of the Crusades themselves. The sources that I recommend you look up on this information would first be Nabil Qureshi's book, No God But One, where an ex-Muslim documents his examination of the Crusades in comparison to his own religious warfare in history while he was still a Muslim. Robert Spencer, in History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS, uses exclusively non-Christian and anti-Christian sources when establishing a consistent pattern of invasion from the 7th to the 21st century on the part of Islam. And finally, Bill Warner in Jihad versus the Crusades, where Muslim and Christian records both note the battles that took place and are plainly cited. It is worth noting that the grand total of battles that took place during the time of the Crusades was a little over 12. Now, compare that to the Muslim expansion and the hundreds of battles that had taken place for the 2 centuries leading up to this, it makes a fair point. But with all of this said and established, our understanding of the Crusades is as follows. After 200 years of expansion from the Muslims in the south, a atrocity that took place when an exchange of power from the Seljuk Turks sacked the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Byzantine and the Roman Catholic Church finally united in common purpose to provide a military escorted pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The First Crusade was somewhat successful, although atrocities were committed along the way. The Second Crusade was largely a failure. Even though they took one city, they lost essentially their route in taking this journey, this pilgrimage by land again. The Third Crusade likewise was a failure because the port cities were lost on a part of superior Muslim coordination. And finally, the Fourth Crusade never even went to that part of the world at all. It was a betrayal on the part of the Roman Catholic Church towards the Byzantines. So, with all that said, we can't look to their sacred text. We can't necessarily look at their culture, but we certainly can look for a need for self-preservation in what inspired the Crusades. But we have to simply acknowledge history, and this is what took place in medieval Europe. Now, the Viking Raids. Noting and comparing to these events, what do the records say? Well, since I'm not going to make the assumption that you're going to take my word for it, what I'm going to do is when the records say something, I'm not going to summarize. I'm going to literally read through them for you. And you can look these up and compare and contrast and see if these are properly being represented, and we will all come to the same conclusions by a plain reading of the primary sources. These are direct quotations from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in noting the first mention in the invasion of England and France, at least as we call them today. AD 793. This year came dreadful forewarnings over the land of the Northumbrians, terrifying the people most woefully. These were immense sheets of light rushing through the air, and whirlwinds and fiery dragons flying across the firmament. These tremendous tokens were soon followed by a great famine, and not long after, on the 6th day, before the Ides of January in the same year, the harrowing inroads of heathen men, that is the Vikings, made lamentable havoc in the church of God in the Holy Island by rapine and slaughter. So the first noted record in 793 of men from the north, the heathen men, after they note some very dramatic signs in the heavens, resulted in a mass rape and slaughter of a non-combatant location known as the church. In AD 794, this year died Pope Adrian, also Offa, king of America. On the 4th day before the Ides of August, after he had reigned 40 winters, Ethelred, king of the Northumbrians, was slain by his own people. On the 13th day before the Calends of May, in consequence of which bishops Clewulf and Eadbald retired from the land, Everth took the government of America and died the same year. Eldebert, whose other name was Prynne, obtained the kingdom of Kent, and Alderman Ethelherd died on the calends of August. In the meantime, the heathen armies spread devastation among the Northumbrians and plundered the monastery, not the military outpost, the monastery of King Everth in the mouth of the Wear. There, however, some of the leaders were slain. Some of their ships were also shattered to pieces by the violence of the weather. Many of the crew were drowned, and some who escaped alive to shore were soon dispatched at the mouth of the river. I wonder by whom. AD 832. This year heathen men overran the Isle of Sepri. AD 833. This year fought King Egbert with 35 pirates, it's referring to the Vikings, at Charmouth, where a great slaughter was made, and the Danes remained masters of the field. 2 bishops, Hereford and Wigan, and 2 aldermen, Duda and Osmod, died the same year. AD 837. This year, Alderman Wulfherd fought at Hampton with 33 pirates. After great slaughter, obtained the victory, but he died the same year. Alderman Ethelhelm also, with the men of Dorkshire. Fought with the Danish army in Portland Isle, and for a good while put them to flight. But in the end, the Danes became masters of the field and slew the alderman. Note, not many notes of invasion on the part of those in the British Isles. This was an expansion and aggression from the north. 838, the year Alderman Halbert was slain by the heathens, and many men with him along the marshlanders. The same year afterwards in Lindsey, East Anglia, and Kent, there many men slain by the army. This was a military encounter. 839. This year there was great slaughter in London, Canterbury, and Rochester. AD 865. This year sat the heathen army in the Isle of Thanet, and made peace with the men of Kent, who promised money therewith. But under the security of peace, the promise of money, the army in the night stole up the country and overran all of Kent eastward. So, violating a treaty, they took the plunder and killed anyway. And again, on they go for the next 200 years. The second factor in noting what the records say is the trans-Saharan and Andalusian slave trade. Its sources, of course, are provided not from me, but from Fander, Pfander, and the research of Sarah Foster, who has a decided investment in knowing what exactly the Muslims were doing in the north 700 years before the transatlantic slave trade brought African slaves to the Americas. What was happening in between that time in Africa when the Islamic Empire was at its zenith. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Annals of Ulster, and the History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS, white-skinned women were favored in Muslim slave markets in northern Africa, Andalusia, it's known today as Spain, and Saudi Arabia itself due to the example of their prophet Muhammad, whose favorite sex slave was Mary the Copt from Egypt, who, needless to say, was white-skinned, and the sources also heavily emphasize their prophet was also white-skinned as well. Noting this high demand commissioned the Viking expeditions to acquire these slaves and produce a profit. While the primary sources, the noted distinction between the pirates, heathens, and men of the north are often interchangeable, we need to note that these distinctions of regular calls for peace with the Norsemen were accepted. The reports from the victims and profiteers of these raids do mention those from the north as one of many sources these women were ultimately the prophet of. And these are corroborated by both primary sources and modern sources. So note that. What were the atrocities committed during the Viking raids? Again, instigating open war for 200 years against the British, French, and Northern European coasts. And I say that in the modern sense. They weren't called the British, French at that time, but note the point. The second atrocities were robbery, destruction of property, and murder of non-combatants in monasteries and abbeys, as we read. And lastly, the contribution to the Muslim sex slave trade. What led up to these events? First, Norse culture. Vikings, or the word literally in ancient Norse is a word used to describe those who went on expeditions, were seeking opportunities to gather riches they couldn't acquire in their homeland, as well as the chance to demonstrate their prowess in battle. Now, that second point will be important when we get to the religious motivation in a moment. The second factor that led up to this was Norse environment. While the lands in modern Norway, Sweden, and parts of Finland was pretty neutral in some of the early Viking raids, but they are all sustainable. They don't give all of the luxuries the world has to offer, so note that while Norse politics was surprisingly stable, and the only conflicts that happened in a more dramatic or open sense were against invaders or between elected chiefs in honorable combat to answer each other for slights and so forth, thus limiting the opportunities within their own territories to die in battle. When it was considered dishonorable to commit violence against members of your own fellow tribe members or other tribes that were at peace with your own, again, this was usually the case. The stability within the environment of Europe, or rather in the Norse territories, made it so that people were looking for battles that weren't necessarily there. Again, for good reason. Their government, their politics were surprisingly stable. This is what brings us to the main issue, Norse religion. The collection of oral traditions that make up our understanding of what ancient Norse paganism was are based on three primary sources, all dated to the end of the Viking Age in the 11th century. The Poetic Eddas, which is a collection of books about the Norse gods and the heroes they interacted with. The Prose Eddas, which is a series of commentaries, explanations, and insights set in the narrative of the wranglings of Gylfi and others that were noting the themes that were already mentioned in the Eddas, giving us more details about them. And of course the sagas, which again were dramatic records of people who lived in light of the belief that these things were true, referring to Norse paganism. The most significant and relevant aspect of any religion is of course going to be their view on the afterlife, and according to Gylfaginning, which is the majority of the Prose Eddas by the way, Section 20, 38 through 52, and others, details as available only for those who die in battle. Now, catch this. The afterlife is reserved for those who die gloriously in battle. Odin, according to Gylfaginning, is preparing for the event known as Ragnarok, and he needs the best warriors. This puts into the minds of everyone who believes this is true into an obligation to prove themselves in battle wherever and whenever they can. Where are they going to find it? Thus the expeditions. But again, don't take my word for it. Gylfaginning, section 20, reads, Odin is called All-Father because he is father of all the gods. He is also called father of the slain because, listen very closely, all those that fall in battle are the sons of his adoption. For them he appoints Valhall and Vingolf. They are called champions. He is called God of the Hanged, God of Gods, God of Cargoes, and he has also been named in many more ways after he had come to King Gerodir. In the Eddas itself, the primary main source for Odinism, and as we understand ancient Norse paganism, in verses 8 through 10 of Grimnismal we read, The fifth is Glathheim, and gold bright there stands Valhall, stretching wide. There does Odin each day choose the men who have fallen in fight. Notice, fallen in fight, not in peaceful coexistence with their community, not in the religious appreciation of the greater aspects and secrets of the universe. No, those who have fallen in fight. Those are the ones that Odin have gathered. For him, easy it is to know rather, for him to who Odin comes and beholds the hall. Its rafters are spears, with shields it is roofed, on its benches are breastplates strewn. Easy is it to know for him to whom Odin comes and beholds the hall. There hangs a wolf by the western door, and o'er it a eagle hovers. And also note in Grimnismal, section 18, 25, and 36, they note carnal delights with the best food, drink, and women to service you. This is detailed for us in Gylfaginning, section 41. Then said Gangleri, A very mighty multitude of men is in Valhall, so that by my faith, Odin is a very great chieftain, since he commands so large an army. Now, what is the sport of the champions when they are not fighting? Har replied, every day, as soon as they are clothed, they straightway put on their armor and go out of the court to fight and fell each other. That is their sport. And when the time draws near to Undermeal, they ride home to Valhall and sit down to drink. Even as it is said here, all the Inhjarjar in Odin's court deal out blows every day. The slain they choose and ride from the strife, sit later in love together. This, of course, is referencing to sexual activity. What motivated these events? With all that said, was it the sacred texts that motivated the Viking raids? Absolutely. The only guarantees of the afterlife for anyone in Norse culture were for thieves and for noble warriors. Niflheim, what is most directly comparable to hell in Christian understanding, is a place of torture for those who had earned the displeasure of the gods through robbery. Valhalla was a place of pleasure for those who had earned the favor of Odin and Freya as they prepared for Ragnarok. This desire to demonstrate martial prowess earned the favor of the gods and, again, could be connected directly to the expeditions that constituted of taking plunder in battle rather than robbing their neighbors for this wealth and this opportunity to show themselves worthy of Odin's halls. Was it their culture that motivated the Viking raids? Well, again, similarly to the Crusades, perhaps. Apparently there is a difference between robbing someone when they don't know you and robbing them when they do after beating them up or murdering them. The distinction was exclusive to Norse culture, so therefore it couldn't be a source of justification, or rather it could be. The only reason it's not a certain answer like the religious text is because justification isn't necessarily motivation. We have to go on the foundations of their culture in their religious text to get that answer. If I say, well, just because you can, that doesn't mean you did. So note that point. And of course, was it because of self-preservation, like the Crusades? No. The plunder taken from these expeditions, again, certainly wasn't for show. They used it to provide for their families. But at the same time, Northern Europe isn't a barren wasteland. It's cold, but it's not entirely useless. They could live lives of self-reliance without needing to travel to other nations for their resources. But they chose to make these expeditions anyway. Why? Not because their livelihoods depended on it, not because of a regard, or rather it was because of a regard for the favor of their gods. Since Norse culture was surprisingly well organized, despite their behavior towards other nations, there wasn't a lot of opportunities for tribal warfare except for the elite leading these tribes. It was a religious motivation and a cultural justification for these raids, but not a desperate attempt to feed their families lest their society collapse. The sources for this, again, as cited, are Snorri Sturluson in the Prose Eddas, where the earliest primary source on Norse paganism documents their views of the afterlife and thus the motives to perform these raids and justify plunder over theft, as well as the Chronicle of the Kings of Norway, where a number of these raids in action were documented. Also note that Alfred the Great is the one who commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, where the Viking invasion of the British Isles are documented by the victims themselves from the 9th to the 11th century, as we read. Now, in conclusion to all of this, the Crusades and the Viking expeditions were both performed by religious people. The Crusades and the Viking expeditions both committed atrocities in and out of the context of war. The Crusades were defensive against Muslim aggression. The Viking expansions were not. The Viking expeditions were religiously justified. The Crusades were not.